Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about microservices. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, when you design a microservice, do you avoid adding consumer-specific logic in your code? Depends. It depends on if I'm making like a public-facing API or if it's an internal thing or something like that. It very much depends on the use case. I mean, in the I don't know what to call it. Like the best way, of course, is if you can make it completely generic to the consumer. And that's usually what you're going for when you're creating a REST API that is public in some way, at least in my opinion. It's because the leakage will otherwise become pretty annoying for the consumers. It's the equivalent of what happens when you have a system that has grown too large for itself, like an administrative tool or something like like take Facebook or take any of the platforms that you might be using, and you feel like if you think about it, like how many of the features are you using on these platforms? Probably maybe a handful of them, but the vast majority of these systems can cater to all kinds of needs, and that extra noise that you personally might not be using actually degrades the simplicity of the system, at least for you. And that is a trade-off in product development, where you have to figure out what is how many features can we sustain versus how much does that affect the overall experience. I mean, the sweet spot is, of course, if you can have a personalized experience for each person who's using the system, so they don't have to deal with features that are irrelevant to them and only relevant to other people. And the same thing goes in API design, and it's actually one of the tidbits or like the tips that I try to drive home to my software developers that I work with, where like it was a few months ago now, where one of them had been like jokingly complaining about some API that was like they had like really weird designs on the API, and it was like super quote unquote poorly developed. And I explained to them that this is you now. Like, try to keep that with you. Now you're complaining about this API, which I agree. It's like it's not really well designed. Remember now that the reason why that is very often that the software developer who implemented that didn't give two shits about product development or product design, because an API is a product. They didn't think about that because the only thing they thought about was to take the path of least resistance to their goal, which is to ship their feature on time and then move on to the next thing, because they're project oriented. They don't actually think about the consumer because they don't have to, because that's the way that they develop products. And when you do that, you get shitty APIs. And that is exactly what has happened. So try, and you do that too. I promise you, a lot of software developers do the same thing. They do it all the time. Like they write shitty code, or they write things that ad hoc and so forth, because they're not focused on writing something that is good and sustainable or well made for somebody else. They're just looking at their story blindly, saying that, yeah, I need to ship this thing, and I'm going to find the easiest way that I can ship this thing for me. Not the easiest thing for, like, in terms of a consumer. For me, the easiest thing is to do this thing. Incidentally, that's also why a lot of you don't write unit tests, because it's going to affect you negatively to do that. It's going to take time away from you, and you're not often thinking about everybody else. And so when you're designing an API, ideally you want to be able to design it without having consumer logic or something like that. But the reality is that that's not always the case. It's not always possible, because some functionalities are so highly specific to the caller, and if you're working with third parties and so forth, sometimes they simply say that no, we can't build this thing, or we can't do it your way, we have to do it this way. And then it becomes a negotiation between your company and their company, or your team and their team. And so you're fundamentally almost always in a situation where those sorts of compromises are up for discussion. It is identical, in my opinion, at the very least, to product design, where it's always a way off between things. in some systems, as I was mentioning, they have to have certain features because some people that they want to use the system won't use it unless that is there, etc., etc. It's the same thing with your nice clean little API, where you might have requests towards the API that are critical or like are needed by some other party, and then you have to compromise in order for them to get it, or you only have to compromise assuming that there is no other way of solving it. And it's actually, I would say that it's extraordinarily difficult, and most software developers are really shit at this, honest to God, at designing good APIs and doing so in a generic way, which makes it possible for the vast majority of clients to do what they need to do without having to like create custom endpoints or things like that. It's something that it's a bit of a passion thing for me to actually be able to do this effectively, because I argue that it is making well-structured data models and APIs is the biggest cornerstone there is in scaling a system. Anything short, if any of those two things are poorly done, the rest of the system is going to suffer. As I've said in a few other videos, guys, everything starts with the data model. If you have a shitty designed storage system, or like you store things in a weird way, or you have split your domain models in a way that doesn't really make sense, everything else is affected by it. Because when you have a shitty data model, you have to create an API to bridge an API, and that means that you usually have a bad API, which means that you now have to bridge the fact that you have maybe multiple APIs for doing certain things. You have to find some way to communicate with all of them, which means that you might need to add another, like a proxy or something like that, who synchronizes things or like uses message dispatching. It's extremely important that the APIs are well designed, and in some cases you might have functionalities in the APIs that you like are requested, but you can't accommodate because of the way that you have designed the overall data in the database. And I think that if the challenges for the front-end developers, like the biggest challenges for them is to make all the UI be consistent across all browsers, and like not have any CSS bugs or like these sorts of visual issues that they have, or like designs being off. If that is the biggest it is one of the most frustrating problems that you have to deal with as a front-end developer. One of the most frustrating and difficult things there is for a back-end developer is to deal with shitty API designs where like there's no documentation. The APIs are like, the data is like arcane as hell, and you want to do something in your system, and in order to do that thing you basically have to go through a forest of different calls to different systems, or like try to figure out how will I actually make this thing work, because they have architected a system that doesn't really accommodate the feature that you want to build. This is a reoccurring problem, and I would even say that you're probably going to meet that problem on a pretty regular basis in backend. So what I want you to take away from this is that on average, of course, it's good if you can avoid consumer-specific logic in your code when you're writing a microservice, assuming now that it's supposed to be a generic thing, because in some cases you do have microservices that are like more specific to the consumer, where you have servers that are like one-to-one mappings and one to a few systems, etc., etc., and then it's not really a problem to add consumer-specific logic. It really comes down to what the intention of and like the use case of that service is about. And for public things, it's usually a good idea for you to create this in a very generic fashion, because you don't know who the consumer is, so you want it to be applicable to as many people as possible. That of course comes with the downside, as I've mentioned, that you might not have the same level of customization or that possibility towards your consumer. But that it's always a negotiation. You can't just declare and say, I'm not going to build that feature that you want because this is a specific thing for you. That's never going to work. As soon as you say that and they say, well, then we're going to take our money and go somewhere else, or then we're not going to play ball with you, your product manager is going to start sweating and say, well, we have to do it. and then you just fold and do it, because that's the way you make money in this situation. And that's the thing that ultimately is more important than whether or not you can abide by some principle that you have decided upon, which, although nice, is at the end of the day arbitrary in comparison, or like it's not as important as like making progress with like whatever business goals that you have. It's happening all the way everywhere, guys. You look at every single system that you ever used that is not designed and tailored just for you, and you're gonna find a few features there that you don't even care about. And the reason why they're there is because somebody cares about them, even though it might come at the expense of your user experience. Have a great day.